SEP Fanfic Readings presents Accidental Proposal by CJRed. Chapter 19. Tea United. Hermione was dreading tea with Narcissa in a way she had not dreaded something since the war. It was not, however, for the reasons you would assume. She had little to no fear of returning to Malfoy Manor. It was just a pile of rocks, and to be perfectly honest, many more horrors had happened on the very grounds of the castle to her than in that home. It wasn't even dealing with Narcissa Malfoy, although that was a factor. She was dreading how Draco would react to his mother. Hermione didn't like the people close to her to be hurt, and Draco was clearly hurting in the week leading up to the tea. That morning, as she listened to her brother worry for her at the same time he chastised her for snogging Draco in the common room, she finally had enough and gave him a long look. "Theodore, I love you, but if you do not drop or dial back this big brother act, I will hex you into a hospital bed." Her tone was low and uncompromising. Theo's eyes went wide with shock, and he started to splutter, but she shook her head at him, her eyes glaring daggers. "If and when I require you to be the prattish older brother, I will tell you. However, you shouldn't forget that I am actually older than you, and have survived a war where I was required to make life or death decisions, and did in fact kill a few wizards and magical creatures in battle. Honestly, one tea with Narcissa Malfoy is not going to break me. I highly doubt her curse work is as advanced as her sister's was." Theo went white with a mixture of horror and shock. "Hermione," he said weakly. She sighed. "Theo, you are testing my patience. I don't need a keeper, I need a brother. If I decide to drag Draco off to the room of requirement and shag him silly after tea today, it really doesn't involve you." Before he could close his mouth and open it to speak, she held up a hand. "And furthermore, if he manages to not murder his mother, I just might shag him silly because it will be a bloody miracle, given how tense he is over this whole matter." Blaise coughed to hide his laughter before he said, "He could definitely do with a good shag to loosen him up." Hermione smirked and then turned back to her red-faced brother to poke him in the chest. "Stop it, Theo! So you saw us snogging, who cares? We are consenting adults, back off!" Theo sat back stunned before he nodded slowly and rubbed a hand down his face in irritation. "Just don't bloody tell me about it," he said weakly. Hermione smirked into her tea. "Done, if you stop watching us when we snog and keep your rude noises and opinion to yourself." Theo gave a long nod and grimaced. "Right, but don't expect me to obey the tie on the door rule. You still are my sister." Hermione laughed and then sobered. "Sounds fair. I promise not to shag in your dorm room." Theo shuddered and stood up looking red-faced. "I am going now before I say or do something that gets me hexed." Hermione raised an eyebrow and nodded. "Wise of you," she said as her brother walked off stiffly. Blaise held up his teacup to her in salute. "Brilliant of you. Very Gryffindor." Hermione rolled her eyes and put some marmalade on her toast. "Why is Draco late to breakfast?" Blaise sighed and then shook his head, his eyes troubled. "Drake never handles things like this well. He will skip eating before tea." Hermione sighed and then nodded, standing up. "Where is he?" Blaise paused and then said, "Still in the dorm, I would imagine." Hermione nodded and headed out to find her missing fiancé. Draco sat on his bed, tossing a snitch, and wishing he could be anyone else but him that day. Tea with his mother? A disaster waiting to happen. He had already checked with the house elf in charge of monitoring his mother to find out that she was a bit delirious today. Kept asking for his father. Draco shook his head and watched the snitch float a bit in front of him before he grabbed it again and sank back into the pillows in annoyance. He had warned Hermione about his mother's mental state of mind, but he knew that it was simply something she would have to see to believe. He knew she was worried he was going to attack his mother or some such thing, but the truth was he was more afraid of what his mother was going to do. If she had a lucid moment and realized exactly whom she was having tea with, it could get ugly. In her current state, she did not place Hermione Granger and Hermione Knott in the same body. Draco sighed and looked up as someone came through the door, but he sat up as he saw that it was Hermione, her face troubled. "Hey," she said simply, shutting the door firmly and warding the door quickly before she moved over to sit down and look at him, her face open and worried. "I missed you at breakfast." Draco nodded. "Sorry, I just wasn't hungry." Hermione took his hand, and he let her, sighing as she linked their fingers with his. "Do you want to talk about what is really worrying you?" He snorted at her. Of course she would realize he had been putting off his real upset all week. "My mother isn't right in the head, Hermione." She nodded at him. "I know. You warned me." He sighed and pulled her into his arms, holding her to him, and breathing in his scent. "No, you don't understand. She is totally batty. I should have put her in St. Mungo's, but I haven't." Hermione tilted her head up, face concerned. "Why not?" Draco shrugged. "Father was against it. She wouldn't get the luxury she was accustomed to there. So instead, I have a house elf watching her, and we hired a full-time healer." Hermione sighed, but gave a short nod. "So you are worried about how my visit will affect her?" Draco shook his head slowly. "No, not as much as I should be. I honestly don't care if you upset her, but I do care if she upsets you." Hermione hugged him and sighed into his chest, causing him to have goosebumps from her warm breath. "Draco," she said slowly, "I know she isn't in her right state of mind. I understand she might say something insensitive or downright cruel." Draco grunted and then said gruffly, "She could be simpering and sweet, which honestly would be just as awful." Hermione smiled and rubbed her nose in his shirt before she said on a deep breath, "Let's just not borrow trouble, Draco. If it's awful, we can leave early. Otherwise, we will be polite, understanding, and united." He pulled her up, gripping her chin as shivers ran through him at her words. "United?" She smiled at him, her blue eyes dancing with a gleam he had seen often in her brown ones days of past. He had asked her once if she wanted her old eye color back, to which she had shrugged and said it really didn't matter, and as it seemed important to Bop that she leave them blue. He looked deeply into them and sighed. "I don't deserve you," he said on a sigh. She frowned and reached up to push his hair off his face. "Maybe not, but you have me, Draco Malfoy, and I don't abandon anyone. We will show up for tea. I will hold your hand, and we will show a united front." He smirked at her and kissed her sweetly. "Very Gryffindor," he said against her lips. Hermione smacked him and sat up. "I am a Gryffindor, and you are a Slytherin. I will just face this head-on, and you have about 5 escape plans for us to use." He grinned now and nodded, hugging her back to his chest and kissing her hair. 6, actually. Hermione laughed and pinched his side. "I am going to go and get ready. Pansy is helping me, so I am sure I will look like the perfect little pureblood bride-to-be." Draco grimaced and kissed her again quickly, helping her sit up before he sank back, looking dejected. "Are you sure you aren't feeling sick?" Hermione shook her head at him, heading for the door before she turned around and said firmly, "Draco." He raised an eyebrow, and she smiled at him. "If you mind your manners, I may have a surprise for you." He sat up at that, finally interested in the day. "What kind of surprise?" She shrugged as she slipped out the door, and winked at him, causing him to go hard instantly. The minx. Pansy stormed in 2 hours later with a velvet bag and a surprised look on her face. "Drake is almost giddy. What did you do? Slip him a potion?" Hermione smirked and then shrugged. "Of course not. I simply informed him that if he minded his manners, I would reward him." Pansy whistled in appreciation. "Devious. I like it. You are bribing him. What will be his reward?" Hermione flushed and ducked her head as Pansy snickered. "Brilliant of you," she said, handing over the bag. "This is from Drake. He wants you to wear it for tea." Hermione let the jewels fall into her hand and gasped as she saw what it was. The earrings she had mooned over on their date were in her hand with a beautiful matching necklace. And, as he had promised, they weighed next to nothing. She put them on with shaking fingers before holding the necklace out to Pansy, who studied it a moment, and then walked around Hermione to put it on. They had put her hair up in an elegant twist, and she was wearing a spectacular day suit in a deep purple that made her eyes look almost violet. She watched as Pansy transfigured the silver combs in her hair to match the jewelry. "You really are great at transfiguration," Hermione said, turning her hair to look at the combs. Pansy flushed at the compliment, and then got to work on Hermione's makeup. She was in 5-inch light pink leather shoes that had a matching clutch, and as she looked over herself, she had to admit she looked like a princess going to tea. She grabbed her cloak, which she doubted she would need, and after hugging Pansy in thanks, she headed out to meet Draco, who was waiting in the common room wearing deep blue dress robes. "I'm not going to wear robes," she said by the way of greeting. Draco looked over her greedily and cleared his throat. "It won't matter. You are stunning." Hermione flushed. "Thank you. Shall we go?" Draco walked over and held out his arm, which she took with a smile, and with a nod at her brother, who was gaping at her a bit as they headed out. They were fleeing to the manor from Slughorn's office, and Hermione let Draco go first before she took a deep breath and followed him, saying very clearly and firmly that her destination was Malfoy Manor, sitting room. She used her wand to get rid of the soot from her suit and hair, and looked up to see Draco handing her cloak and his to a small house elf, who popped away immediately. "She is waiting for us in the conservatory," Draco said softly, taking her hand in his. Hermione gave him a reassuring nod and fell into step with him as they moved through the quiet house. She noticed portraits staring at them curiously, but none of them spoke as they made their way through what must have been the main hallway and past the dining room. Draco shuddering as he got a look at the large table. Hermione clung to his hand, trying to offer whatever support she could. The conservatory was full of magical and muggle plants that looked healthy and lush. A beautiful glass table with soft velvet chairs waited for them as they entered. Narcissa Malfoy stood up, her face full of joy. "Draco, it is so lovely to see you," Narcissa said, walking forward to kiss her son. Hermione tried to keep her face open and friendly as Draco pulled her forward. "Mother, may I present my fiancée, Miss Hermione Knott." They had agreed to use her real name and not her adopted one, hoping his mother would not remember her name Hermione at all. "Ah, yes, how lovely to meet you, Miss Knott." Hermione smiled and dipped her head. "And you, Mrs. Malfoy." Narcissa gestured for them to take their seats, and she had to let go of Draco's hand to take her seat. She noticed he scooted his chair closer to hers, and she put her hand on his thigh, smiling at him reassuringly when he looked at her. He looked a little lost. "I do apologize that Lucius is not here today to meet you. I simply couldn't track him down today," Narcissa said smoothly. Hermione maintained her smile as she felt Draco stiffen next to her. "That's quite all right, Mrs. Malfoy," Hermione said, smoothing into the awkward silence. "I am sure he is very busy." Draco cleared his throat and said softly, "How are you, Mother?" Narcissa beamed at him. "I am very well, thank you. Now tell me, how did you two meet?" Hermione bit her lip and looked to Draco, who was looking at his mother with a mixture of annoyance and worry. "I met her a long time ago, Mother. She goes to school with me." Narcissa Malfoy frowned for a moment and then smiled. "Oh, of course. But I meant, when did the relationship grow?" Hermione took over, her tone soft. "We were reacquainted this summer at my brother's flat in London." "Oh, yes, how wonderful! And how is Theodore doing? Your father must be very pleased by the engagement. I wonder who Theo has his eye on." Hermione tensed and then just nodded, looking over at Draco, who was slightly pale. She squeezed his leg, shaking her head at him. He sighed and nodded, and she knew he wouldn't tell his mother that Knott Sr. was now dead. Narcissa had many questions about the wedding that Hermione simply had no answer to. Draco filled in a few blanks, assuring his mother that he had things well in hand. When it was brought up that Hermione would want to redecorate the manor before she moved in, Hermione spoke quickly before Draco could. "I think that we would like to have our own place for a bit. Draco is going to build me a lovely house by the sea, and we will spend our time there before we have children." Narcissa Malfoy frowned for a moment, and then waved her hand merrily. "I suppose that is a wonderful idea. I did enjoy the time I had alone with Lucius the first 2 years we were married, when we resided in France." Hermione nodded and let out a sigh of relief. The rest of tea passed neatly, Narcissa wanting to know all about Draco's schooling and if he had decided to seek a mastery in potions or not. Draco looked over at Hermione, who paused to study him. "I think it would be wonderful," she said honestly. Draco nodded and sighed. I would like to, yes." Hermione smiled at him and said, "We could attend the Wizarding University in Cambridge if you like. I would like to continue my studies as well after graduation." Draco smirked at her. "More school?" Hermione shrugged. "I do well in school," she defended. Narcissa had a faraway look on her face when they turned back to her. "Your voice, it's rather familiar," Narcissa said with a frown. Hermione looked over at Draco, who was standing. "Mother, it's getting rather late. We should be going." Narcissa stood up, her eyes still cloudy. "Yes, of course, dear. I need to check on dinner plans for your father's return." Draco called for an elf, who showed up and left with a slightly befuddled-sounding Narcissa. Draco ran a hand down his face and then slumped back down in his chair. "That was lucky," he said finally. Hermione sighed. "It's rather sad. Will she always be like this?" Draco shrugged, staring after his mother. "I'm not sure. She was improving until father lost his appeal. Since he went to Azkaban, her letters have been nothing but ramblings. She is certainly better with him than without." Hermione frowned at this and sat up. "Was that taken into account when he was sentenced?" Draco looked at her, frowning. "I am not sure, although I would think not. What care would they have over a Death Eater's wife's mental stability? They knew she was worse in this house with all the reminders of the war and still sentenced her to house arrest here." Hermione stood up angrily and nodded curtly. "We have 3 hours before we have to be back. Care for a detour?" Draco stood up, looking at her warily. "I know that look. What are you up to, Granger?" Hermione smirked and gestured at him. "Get me somewhere I can apparate, and I will show you."